All right, I want to welcome everyone to class. As we know, we're going to be covering chapter 3 today. And as you can see here, chapter 3 focuses on the issue of culture. Now, let me just say here that this is probably one of the most important chapters that we're going to cover. And the reason why is because culture is vastly important in terms of who we are. Culture influences every single aspect of our lives. And so if you're ever curious to find out about, who we are and why do we have certain belief systems, why do people within our society act a certain way, you have to examine the culture in which they come from. And so this is why this chapter is so important. And this is also why examining other cultures is so important, because one of the things that I'm going to argue in this chapter is that I would encourage everybody to travel and to examine firsthand other cultures, because when you do that, you not only learn about that particular culture, you actually learn about your own culture by examining other people's culture. And so this is why this chapter is so important. Now, when I want you to remember here that when you guys are reading the chapter, I want you to focus on the chapter objectives. And these objectives are at the beginning of every chapter. Now, these objectives are what the chapter, when you read in chapter, this is what you're supposed to get out of the chapter. So again, when you read in the chapter, I want you to focus on these objectives, because a lot of the assignments in the modules, your exam questions are based on these objectives. So if you cover and if you know these objectives, you should do well in each of the modules. Okay. All right. Now, one of the first objectives that we're going to focus on here is what exactly is culture. Now, as you can see here, culture is the knowledge, language, values, customs, material objects that are passed on from people to people or from generation to generation. Now, one of the most important things I want you to remember about culture is something that is learned. Culture is not something that is natural. It is learned, um, and we are socialized within specific culture. Now, culture influences every single aspect of who we are. Our ideas, our notions of right or wrong, the values that we hold dear, all of these are influenced by our culture. Culture even influences, the cars that we drive, how we talk, the language we use is influenced by our culture, how we dress, the foods that we eat is all influenced by the culture in which we are socialized or raised in. And so culture is extremely important in terms of determining who we are as individuals. And so this is why this chapter is very important. Now, as I said before, our ideas, our values, our norms is influenced by culture. This is why, a lot of Americans believe in the notion of individuality, because we live in a country, we live in a culture that tells us that we are individuals. And so this is why we internalize, and this is why we believe these notions of individuality. Now, as I said earlier, culture influences every single aspect of our lives. The music we listen to, whether it's rap music or country music or alternative music, is all influenced by culture. And so this is again why culture is so important. All right, now let's talk about some of the different components of culture. And these components of culture exist in every society, exist in every culture. So every culture has formal norms, every culture has informal norms, and every culture has material versus non-material aspects that make up that particular culture. So let's talk about what these couple of these terms are. We know that formal norms are laws or rules that are usually written down. Now, when you violate these formal norms, you can be punished. So, for example, if we were to examine this country, we would know that a formal norm in this country is that we're supposed to drive on the right side of the road. Now, if you go to other countries, for example, in Jamaica, you're supposed to drive on the left side of the road. And so that would be a formal norm in terms of Jamaican culture. Now, informal norms, these are still rules, but these are not written down. People generally understand or know these rules by being part of that particular culture. So one of the key differences with formal and informal norms is the fact that formal norms are written down, informal norms are not written down. They're generally understood, when you are part of that particular culture. So again, an example of informal norm in this country again is the fact that, if you are a woman and you were to wear a bikini to class, it wouldn't be seen as normal, but nobody's going to punish you per se, particularly if it is a school that doesn't have any sort of dressing requirements. Now, people may look at you funny, but you're not going to be arrested for wearing a bikini to class. And so this could possibly be an example of informal norm. So please make sure you understand the difference between formal and formal norms. These are laws and rules and regulations that tend to be written down. And informal norms, these are rules that are not written down. You generally understand these rules by being part of that particular culture. All right, now let's get into what material culture is. As it says here, material culture refers to the physical objects that are associated with a particular culture. Physical objects could be clothes, could be food, could be money, could be machines, could be buildings. All of these will be examples of material culture. Now you see some of these pictures here. All these would be examples of material culture in terms of American culture. The Apple iPhone, for example, would be part of America's material culture. Even though it is built in China, it's still part of American culture. The food we eat, different types of food that we eat in this country would also be an example of material culture. So again, material culture, these are things that you can touch and feel, that is part of a certain culture. Now, non-material culture refers to the abstract or intangible human creations that are part of a certain society. So non-material culture are things that you cannot touch and you cannot taste or feel. So our language would be part of a non-material culture. Our belief in democracy, our ideas of right or wrong, our values would be part of a non-material culture. Our belief in individuality, all of these would be non-material culture. So again, material culture are things that you can touch and feel that are part of a certain society. Non-material culture are abstract or intangible human creations. Our ideas, our values, our belief systems would be examples of non-material culture. Now, one of the questions I want you to think about is which one of these elements of culture, non-material or material, is more difficult to change and why? Now, if you think about it, non-material culture is actually more difficult to change. Non-material culture, again, which is our values and our belief systems, are much more ingrained. They're much more cherished. So, for example, it's much more easier to change a person's cell phone than to change their belief about God, right? And so this is exactly why non-material culture is so much more difficult to change. And so this is why, and this is also why non-material culture tends to generate so much more controversy, because people hold their beliefs, their values very, very closely. And so, if you believe in God, it's very difficult for you to change that belief systems as opposed to changing your car. And so this is why non-material culture is much more difficult to change as opposed to material culture. All right, now let's get into the difference here between ideal versus real culture. And again, these are another examples of your chapter objectives. Now, we know that in every culture, there are always gaps between what people say they believe in or what the culture itself says they value versus what actually happens in that particular culture or in that particular society. And so this difference, this gap between the culture belief and what actually happens would be an example of the gap between ideal versus real culture. Now, ideal culture, as it says here, refers to the values and standards of behavior that people say they believe in, or a culture itself says that it believes in. Whereas real culture is what actually is what actually happens in that particular culture. Now, you can think about different examples of this gap between ideal versus real. One clear example in this country is the fact that in this country, our ideal, and we have a lot of ideals in this country. One of our ideals is our belief in equality. There's a lot of Americans who profess that they believe in equality. All man should be treated equally. And I think this is in many ways ingrained in our Constitution. The reality, however, so again, the ideal is our ideas and notions that we believe in equality for all. Real culture, however, or the reality, however, is the fact that we know for a fact that some people, I shouldn't say most people, some people in this country are not treated equally. And so again, this is the difference between ideal culture versus that of real culture. And the reality is that this gap between the ideal and real exists in every single culture. Every single culture has these gaps, and so this is one of the goals of cultures themselves, to close the gap that exists between the ideal and what is defined as the real culture. All right, now let's get into the differences within cultures. And we know that there are a lot of differences within cultures. And we're going to talk about the difference between dominant culture, subculture, and countercultures. So let's get into the first. Now, dominant culture, as it says here, refers to the values and the practice of the most powerful group within a certain society. Now, you can think about dominant culture as mainstream culture. This is what the majority of people within a certain society follows. Now, there are many examples of dominant culture in this country. For example, speaking English is part of America's dominant culture. It's because most Americans speak English. Even though there's a lot of bilingual speakers in this country, most Americans speak English. Other examples is the fact that most Americans, particularly when we do research, claim or say that they believe in God. So believing in God would be an example of dominant culture, because again, this is what the majority of Americans follow. Other examples is our belief in heterosexuality. So again, most Americans are heterosexual. Most Americans believe in heterosexuality. And so this is why heterosexuality or belief in heterosexuality would be an example of dominant culture, because this is what the majority follows. And a lot of times when people go against the dominant culture, there is repercussions. And so we can talk about and we can see and we can think about some of these repercussions when people go against some of these dominant cultural norms within certain societies. Now, a subculture is a group of people who share distinct values and belief systems that set them apart in very significant ways from members of the dominant culture. Now, one of the things that I want you to remember about a subculture is that subcultures tend to exist harmoniously with members of the dominant culture. Now, there are many examples of subcultures: teenagers, skateboarders, the different immigrant groups that we have in this country, Mexicans, Jamaicans, Haitians. All of these would be examples of subcultures, because again, they have their own belief systems. So for example, if you're Mexican, you may have certain beliefs that is different from the average American, but these groups exist harmoniously with members of the dominant culture. Now, a very interesting example of a subculture is the Amish. And hopefully you guys have heard about the Amish people. They have very different belief systems, very interesting belief systems. And if you guys want to do a Google search for the Amish people, you'll see here that they have very different belief systems than members of the dominant culture. But even though they have different belief systems, they have different values and norms, they tend to exist harmoniously with members of the dominant culture. So they're not actively trying to change members of the dominant culture. So this is why they would be regarded as a subculture. Now, another variation within culture is that of a counterculture. Now, these are groups that strongly reject many aspects of the dominant culture, and they actively, and this is important, they actively try to bring about change to the larger society. So The hippie movement of the 1960s would be an example of a counterculture. The civil rights movement, also of the 1960s, would be examples of dominant culture because they were actively trying to bring about change to the dominant culture. And so this is what makes these groups and these organizations examples of a counterculture. Now, one of the questions that I typically ask my class is, how do we interact with people from different cultures? And I think this is one of the goals of this chapter, to encourage us to, meet people from different cultures and examine different cultures and have these cultural interactions. Now, there are many ways, there are a variety of ways in which we can interact with people from different cultures. We can be ethnocentric, or we can be what is defined as a cultural relativist. Now, let's talk about these two terms, because, again, you need to understand these two terms. Now, an ethnocentric person, or ethnocentrism, is the tendency to assume that your culture or your way of life is better than everybody else. So, for example, when somebody says, America is the best country on the planet and nobody else compares, that is an ethnocentric statement. So again, when you assume that your culture, your way of life is better than everybody else. And the reality is that if you examine every culture, I think most cultures have a bit of ethnocentrism because, that's what they know. And we tend to believe that our culture is better than everybody else. And so most cultures are a bit ethnocentric. So again, ethnocentrism is a tendency to assume that our culture is better than everybody else. Now, the opposite of being ethnocentric is to be what is defined as a cultural relativist. And a cultural relativist is a person that tries to understand why people do what they do from their own cultural perspective. So instead of judging them, instead of dismissing a culture, instead of viewing a culture as inferior, they try to understand why people do what they do from their own cultural perspective. So the importance of being a cultural relativist is to be understanding. They try to understand why people do what they do from their cultural perspective, as opposed to judging them and viewing them as inferior. And so, in my mind, being a cultural relativist is a much better way in terms of how we should interact with other cultures, because I think one of the most important things that we can do is interact with other cultures. Travel, I think, is very important. And when we travel and we interact with other cultures, we learn about not only that particular culture, but we also learn about our own cultures. And so being a cultural relativist is in my mind much better than being ethnocentric. Now, one of the things that we do in my class or in our class is to compare beauty standards around the world, and we do this in order to explain the difference between being ethnocentric and being cultural relativist. Now, I normally talk about what is defined as FGM, which is female genital circumcision or female genital mutilation. Now, this is actually a procedure that is performed on young girls before they hit puberty. And essentially what happens is that part of this young girl's clitoris is basically cut off. And a lot of these girls have little to no sexual feelings, and orgasms are sometimes impossible to experience later on in life. Now, I'm sure some of you guys are asking, why in God's name would people do this? So let's talk about the reasons why these cultures do this. Now, FGM is a cultural practice that originate and is still part of parts of Africa as well as parts of the Middle East. And essentially, it is done to reduce the sexual response of these women, to make them less likely to be sexually active before and after marriage. And so the idea here is that when these girls have this procedure done, it makes them more attractive, because in the cultural's mind and the people within these culture, the idea here is that if they have these procedures done, they're more likely to be faithful within their marriage. And so women who has these procedures done are actually seen as beautiful. And so FGM, or female genital circumcision, is seen as a sign of beauty. And so the idea here is that different cultures have different ideas of beauty. So this is one way to view beauty. Now let's examine our own culture, because as I said before, when we travel and when we examine other cultures, we not only learn about other cultures, we also learn about our own culture. So let's examine the ideas of beauty in this country. Now, I'm sure you guys know who these people are. You have Paula, Abdul, you have one of the Olsons. And obviously these women are very famous, very wealthy. But what's interesting about each of these women is that they suffer from eating disorders. And one of the reasons, and clearly, these women can afford to buy food. So the question becomes, why would they starve themselves? And they do it because in our society, in our culture, part of being beautiful is to be thin. And so this is why not just these women, a lot of women in our country suffer from eating disorders because of how our culture view our notion or view the idea of beauty. Now, one of the things, or one of the questions I want you guys to think about is, how many of you guys would engage in plastic surgery? And if the answer is yes, I would engage in plastic surgery, do you view plastic surgery as a form of mutilation? Is it mutilation or not? And so this is one of the questions I want you to think about, because we know that in our society, there are many forms of plastic surgery. One of the most common ones are breast implants, and breast implants are quite interesting, where a woman, enlarges, for the most part, her breasts. And if you ask a lot of women why they do it, a lot of women say, well, they want to be more attractive. And the question becomes, why don't they feel attractive in the first place? And again, it's because in our culture, part of being beautiful, particularly for women, is to have bigger breasts, essentially. And one of the most interesting aspects of having breast implants is that a lot of women, according to research, after they have breast implants, they actually lose sensation in their breasts. And so what's interesting is that the breast becomes an object of somebody else's desires, which is quite interesting. Another example of our ideas of beauty in this country is, Botox. We know in this country we have actually what is defined as Botox parties, where women have these get-togethers and inject themselves with Botox. Now, for those who don't know, Botox essentially is, poison. I mean, just if we want to be real technical about it. And so this is why we have to be very careful when we start to judge someone else's culture in terms of their ideas and their understandings of beauty, because we in this country do some very interesting things in the name of beauty. And so this is why there's a very thin line between being ethnocentric, where we harshly judge someone else's culture, and being a cultural relativist, where we try to understand why people do what they do from their cultural point of view. And so again, this is why I would argue that being a cultural relativist is much more important and much more valuable and much more preferable than being a ethnocentric or being a person who's ethnocentric. Now, I think that is it for our chapter. Again, if you have any questions, you can always email me. Thank you, and we're going to move on to the next chapter.